one very blatant example of lawfare. This was broadcast on Al Jazeera. It's a conference in Cairo. Ostensibly, the grant that was given by the European Union to the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, and Oxfam, was listed as a grant for promotion of human rights and the establishment of legal processes in the Palestinian Authority. And the money was used for a conference on the impunity and prosecution of Israeli war criminals in Cairo. And you'll notice that you have the Oxfam symbol, and you have, which is funded by the Dutch government, Oxfam Novib, and you have the EU symbol, which is just behind the people who are sitting there. These are blatant abuses of the language of morality and human rights for exactly the opposite. The Goldstone Report, of course, is the most well-known example, perhaps the most lethal example. Over 500 claims, allegations made by NGOs, which were simply cut and pasted into the Goldstone Report. I argue, based on many hours of having listened to and watched and read Goldstone, that he in fact doesn't know much of what was in his own report. We don't know who actually wrote the Goldstone Report. Some of the authors were in fact members or past members of the NGO community, the people who participate in the daily Israel bashing through this process. And many of the claims are unverifiable, at best false in many cases. So the entire facade, the entire structure of Goldstone was built on the basis of NGO claims, and particularly Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch, as I said, Goldstone was a member of the board. They promoted the idea of a commission of inquiry. They lobbied very intensively for it, including with the American government and every government in the Human Rights Council. When the lobbying and the decision of who to appoint was made, and a couple of people turned it down, perhaps even planned in advance, they came up with the name of Richard Goldstone, who was very close to Ken Roth. In fact, we have some emails which were accidentally sent by Goldstone to Roth and sent out to a wider group of people. You can see the closeness, the consultation back and forth during this period. And now Human Rights Watch, since the publication of the Goldstone Report over a year ago, has issued more statements and lobbied more for the Goldstone Report than on any single issue. Not on the massacres in the Congo, not on any other violation of human rights, but in support of the Goldstone process to isolate Israel, to promote the Durban process. And then, of course, we had most recently what was called the Free Gaza Flotilla, which has already been discussed by Ann and others. And again, the moment I was up at 7 o'clock in the morning, the incident happened about 4:30. And as soon as you turned on the news, the NGOs had already published their condemnations. They were clearly written before, all ready to be taken out without any attention to what actually happened. Terms like piracy, terms like murder. Human Rights Watch does what it always does. It urged an independent inquiry by the United Nations, knowing in advance what the results would be. And this gets repeated over and over again. Now, I do not want to leave any audience, especially one as committed to the issues and as dynamic as this, with a sense of powerlessness. All of these examples, all of these abuses can be exposed and I think can be defeated using exactly the same techniques that they use, naming and shaming. These are organizations that use the language of morality to promote a highly immoral agenda. And the contradictions, when they are highlighted, when the focus is shown on them, you begin to get some movement. Even among some journalists, even among Ethan Bronner of the New York Times, when the contradiction becomes too great to ignore. When the fact that the NGOs that are supposed to be working in order to improve the role of government hide their sources of funding. You cannot get any document from the European Union that specifies why it is that the 30, 40, 50 organizations they fund every year under these frameworks that I mentioned, who makes those decisions. We were able to get the documents from the Canadian government with freedom of information. The Canadian government does, in fact, implement its own regulations. And in the case of Canada, it's very blatant. The person who, the Canadian, the IRDC, the International, I forgot what the term stands for, Office for Research and Development of Canada, assigned the evaluation of an organization called Kairos to someone who was one of the heads of an organization called Alternative, which is a radical left-wing organization involved in Israel bashing, based in Montreal, and exactly vice versa. In other words, it was all inside jobs. And what they actually did with the money was never reported by the Canadian office that was in charge of this process. And when it was exposed, the government cut it off. And then in one case, the organization Mada al-Carmel, who had that poster I showed earlier, went to court and sued the Canadian government, I'm proud to say, naming NGO Monitor as the instigator of this, and the case has been closed. Lack of evidence. Because there is no case here. These organizations lack accountability, and except when the documents are available, there are no checks and balances. In governments, as much as one may be critical of how the US government or any other government, democratic government functions, you have visibility, checks and balances, the role of parliaments and Congress. NGOs are an entirely closed shop. They're a dictatorship. By using these techniques of naming and shaming, of gathering the information and making it available publicly, of taking this information to funders and showing them what's being done with their money as opposed to what they thought was being done with their money. It doesn't work with everybody. George Soros knows exactly what's being done with his money. But many others are embarrassed. Many others said, that's not what I intended to do with my donations to the New Israel Fund or the taxpayer money of the European Union or the donations to Human Rights Watch and elsewhere. By challenging the halo effect in the media, an area which we work very closely with Camera on, so that when the New York Times used to publish Human Rights Watch reports condemning Israel as a headline story, simply repeating and copying the allegations without any foundation, they were called to account on that, and that had some ripple effects. As I've said, I think the New York Times now is much more careful, but that doesn't apply to 95% of the media. And every time a reporter or a station chief or a bureau chief changes, you've got to start from the beginning with that. Confronting NGO officials in debates. In most cases, they try to avoid it. In some cases, they can't. And when that takes place, having the information available, pointing out the contradictions, the inconsistencies, the lack of credibility. And promoting the idea that NGOs that claim a moral agenda need to be watched very, very carefully. They themselves are part of the problem, and they themselves are contributing extensively to the degradation of human rights values that they claim to support. In the process, we've had a number of exposés. Ben Berenbaum for the New Republic published a very detailed report on Human Rights Watch, which is still having ripple effects. Robert Bernstein, the founder of Human Rights Watch, a year ago, wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times in which he denounced his own organization. And there as well led to a number of changes which we're still going to be seeing the impacts of, including the appointment of a new head of the board of directors, which hopefully will have some of a moderating impact on Human Rights Watch's bias. Exposing the Saudi fundraising trip, which was a huge contradiction, for an organization that claims to promote human rights, that was founded in New York on the basis of the Helsinki framework. It was originally known as Helsinki Watch. To go to Saudi Arabia, to campaign against Israel and say, we need your money to expose Israeli war crimes in Gaza and to promote the Goldstone Report, and not talk about the oppression of women or minorities or others in Saudi Arabia, is in itself immoral. And then afterwards, of course, the cover-up and saying, well, that's not what we did. The New Israel Fund does a lot of good things. It has a large budget, $31 million a year, 2/3 of which go to social and other programs which do promote important values in Israel. Handicapped access, women's hostels, rape victims, and other activities. But 25 to 30%, a third of that budget, goes to organizations which are very involved in demonization. And the process of getting the New Israel Fund to accept guidelines has been a very difficult fight. But because the donors, who are in fact committed to the Zionist causes, whatever their views on the specifics of settlements and other issues, called the leadership of the New Israel Fund to account and adopted the guidelines that we proposed to them. And we will continue to monitor the implementation of those guidelines on a consistent basis and report back to the donors. The purpose of all of this to quote Professor Dershowitz this morning, is to take back the moral foundations of human rights and not allow them to continue to be used for immoral purposes of attacking Israel. And that's part of NGO Monitor's purpose. I've told people that we hope that we can pack up our bags and go on to something else in 5 years by consistently implementing this program, this activity. We had a major success in the type of concerted activity that we're seeing here today in preventing a repetition of the NGO Forum at the Durban Review Conference of 2009. Erwin and Alan and others, many of you were there at that conference, and there was no NGO Forum. And in fact, the real non-governmental forces that were there to support Israel outnumbered and shocked those NGOs that were used to having the floor completely to themselves. And the sessions that Ann organized and others were tremendously important, and we were labeled as the generals of the Six-Day Durban War. And I think those are medals that we can proudly claim. Because when the NGOs are confronted, when the information is available, when the contradictions are highlighted, they've got no moral foundation, and that's all they've got to stand on. As I said, we've gone to the European Parliament, to the Irish Parliament, to the British Parliament to put this information on the table. We now have regular questions asked from the ministers. They can't ignore the contradictions between the objectives that they proclaim and the way in which their funding is being used. Canadian government has cut back very significantly on the abuse of funding for these kinds of organizations. And I will also say that NGO Monitor has now filed suit against the European Union for violating its own rules on transparency, demanding the release of the documents that allow us to trace how it is that these organizations get funded year after year by the European Union and member states, while their activities are completely contradictory to the principles that allegedly this money is supposed to be used for. We've seen the Ford Foundation cut back very drastically. The Ford Foundation was the main funder of the NGO Forum that took place in Durban in 2001, and they're largely out of the business of funding political advocacy, radical NGOs that are part of the demonization of Israel. And that's a major change and a major success. So at each one of these stages, going after the money is extremely important. Removing the halo effect in terms of journalists and the media. Again, something we've all learned from camera, letter writing, op-ed writing, going after the journalists and forcing them to at least admit that when they quoted an NGO report, they didn't bother to go beyond that. They didn't question. I often ask a journalist, if an Israeli general says to you that Israel did not attack a certain post, will you just write that down as truth, or will you check it? And of course we'll check it. But if an NGO says there were no Hamas forces in this area, or no Hezbollah rockets were fired from Kana, do you check that? No, because these are respected international watchdogs. And I think we're beginning to change that in the process. The website that we have is tracks 150 NGOs. For the students, I say anytime that you've got a speaker, an activity, a BDS-related event on your campus, let us know who's behind it, who's coming, speaker from Amnesty or Breaking the Silence or B'Tselem or Human Rights Watch or the International Solidarity Movement. I'm not going to list all 150 here. Go to our website, look it up. If you have any questions, ask us. That's what we're there for. And we found more and more willingness and ability to use that material. We've also got a lot of material, including the Take Back the Human Rights Agenda button sitting outside. Thank you all very much. And Andrea, keep up the good work.